From space, Palm Jumeirah appears as a perfect act of creation. It looks as though an entire luxury landscape was summoned directly from empty water. But beneath the glittering surface of the Persian Gulf, an entirely different physical mechanism is at work. Dubai did not create this land from nothing. It simply moved a massive section of the living seabed from one location to another. According to official project records, shaping this iconic symmetry required nearly 100 million cubic meters of calcareous sand. That immense volume of material had an ecological and geological location long before it became private beaches and luxury resorts. The dredgers may have left the site years ago, but the physical consequences of their work are still highly active. The island tourists see today began with a seabed they never will. To understand the true scale of this project, you have to follow the sand backward. Every new square meter of luxury real estate began as a subtraction somewhere else beneath the Gulf. The material did not simply materialize at the shoreline. It was drawn up through the suction heads of massive dredging vessels working approximately 11 kilometers offshore. While official Palm sources cite nearly 100 million cubic meters of sand, the marine engineering firm Royal IHC describes relocating approximately 110 million cubic meters across the wider project scope. This slight difference in accounting does not change the massive physical reality of the development. That volume of marine material is extremely difficult to comprehend from the perspective of a finished sunbed. Picture a volume of sand large enough to fill an entire city block, and then multiply that across hundreds of hectares of newly reclaimed land. Extracting it requires disturbing established benthic ecosystems and altering the offshore bathymetry. Before it was a completed island, it was an active extraction zone. Removing that much seabed leaves deep borrow pits that fundamentally change how water currents flow over the ocean floor. Dredging does not simply move material aside and leave the surrounding environment completely untouched. It lifts sediment into the water column and permanently rearranges the biological floor of the sea. The private shoreline is merely the visible half of a transaction whose other half occurred entirely underwater. But relocating millions of tons of sand is only the first phase of the coastal engineering challenge. Loose calcareous sand cannot hold a precise geometric shape against the open ocean. To make the Palm outline viable, the sand required a massive and permanent shield. Engineers constructed a crescent breakwater extending approximately 11 kilometers around the outer edge of the residential fronds. Built from millions of tons of rock, this barrier was designed to absorb incoming wave energy and block the aggressive Shamal winds. It stands as a physical fortress, dividing the manufactured landscape from the wild ocean. Without this continuous armor, the private beaches would simply wash back into the Gulf. The crescent successfully solves the immediate threat of wave erosion. But protecting the reclaimed island from the sea created an entirely new hydrodynamic paradox. The crescent protects the villas, but it also dictates how the water behind those villas behaves every single day. Before construction, tidal currents moved relatively freely along the open Gulf coast. Now, the massive rock perimeter interrupts the natural approach of waves and drastically alters the hydrodynamic flow. The structure that makes the private beach possible also determines how quickly the water beside that beach can leave. This is not a completely sealed system. The project incorporated structural openings specifically intended to promote water exchange with the surrounding Gulf. Tides, local winds, and offshore currents continue to move water in and out of the engineered lagoon. But that tidal movement is not perfectly uniform across the entire development. A peer-reviewed hydrodynamic study of Palm Jumeirah Lagoon measured how long it takes for different sections of water to flush. This critical measurement is known as residence time. On the eastern side of the island, the study found a residence time of approximately 1.2 days. That rapid exchange rate flushes the area continuously, drawing in fresh seawater and maintaining a healthy circulation. But the western side of the exact same lagoon told a completely different hydrodynamic story. Under the studied conditions, water in the western sections recorded a residence time of approximately 42 days. The island is perfectly symmetrical to the eye, but it is entirely asymmetrical to the moving sea. Wind patterns, entrance alignments, and internal bathymetry mean that some pockets of water recirculate deeply between the residential fronds. A 42-day residence time does not mean the water is permanently stagnant or completely dead. It is an average indicator of how long a body of water takes to be substantially replaced. But when water remains trapped for weeks instead of hours, the lagoon becomes highly sensitive to environmental stress. Longer residence times allow ambient heat to persist and fine sediment to remain available for continuous resuspension. Any nutrients, runoff, or pollutants entering those slow-moving pockets will dilute at a drastically reduced rate. This fundamental shift in circulation alters the baseline conditions for every living organism. The physical protection of the breakwater introduced a deeply unequal water clock to the island. Yet despite these altered currents and extended residence times, the rocky crescent itself is not devoid of marine life. Peer-reviewed research documented diverse reef fish communities living directly on Palm Jumeirah's sheltered and exposed breakwaters. The massive rock armor supplied a new hard substrate in an area where such surfaces are quickly colonized by opportunistic organisms. Over time, algae and invertebrates attached to the rough stone, and some corals began to establish themselves in the submerged crevices. Schools of fish now actively use the engineered structure for shelter, breeding, and feeding. Because these artificial communities can become highly abundant, they offer a brief moment of apparent ecological relief. It is easy to look at this new life and assume that nature has simply repaired the damage and adapted to the island geometry. But ecological occupation is not the same as ecological equivalence. Habitat creation does not automatically mean habitat replacement. A new rocky reef built from millions of tons of imported stone does not reproduce every critical function of the environment it originally replaced. The original marine ecosystem was defined by open water circulation, natural reef patches, seagrass meadows, and very specific soft-bottom habitats. The artificial structures can support abundant life, but they produce biological communities that differ fundamentally from those natural systems. The species composition, age structure, and seasonal behavior of the organisms on the breakwater do not perfectly mirror a natural Gulf reef. Different habitats serve entirely different ecological roles, and an artificial hard surface is essentially an ecological substitution. Nature returned, but not necessarily as the exactly same nature that was removed by the dredging vessels. A thriving artificial reef on a breakwater has undeniable value, especially along a heavily urbanized coast. However, it represents a completely novel ecosystem rather than a faithful restoration of what existed before construction began. And this massive environmental shift is not strictly limited to the visible rock wall that tourists can easily observe. The engineering boundary of the real estate project and the true ecological boundary of its impact are not the exact same line. The island may be complete on the property map. Underwater, the biological system it created is still evolving and adapting to the profound structural changes. The visible outline of Palm Jumeirah remains perfectly fixed against the blue water of the Gulf. But during construction, a translucent underwater footprint expanded far beyond that iconic shape. An authoritative United Nations University research synthesis reported on altered fine sediment conditions and biological effects extending outside the crescent. Some of these benthic observations were discussed at distances reaching beyond approximately 800 meters from the breakwater. To understand why the effects of dredging and filling extend far beyond the active construction period, you have to follow one fine suspended particle. Large, heavy grains of calcareous sand fall relatively quickly through the water column to build the visible landmass. But fine sediment behaves completely differently in a dynamic ocean environment. When a dredger operates, it inevitably lifts these tiny particles, suspending them like a massive cloud in the surrounding sea. This single particle is transported by the current, drifting outward until it eventually settles on benthic organisms or alters the soft ocean floor. And its journey does not end when the construction equipment is finally packed away. Under energetic waves or strong seasonal storms, that same settled particle can be resuspended, lifting back into the water column once again. The sunlight dims underwater as the suspended material reduces light penetration, directly affecting the organisms that rely on it for survival. The sensory experience of the sea shifts as the clear acoustics of open water change into a muted, highly turbid environment. A habitat that once thrived in clear conditions must now navigate this recurring influx of suspended material. Extracting millions of cubic meters of material leaves deep borrow pits and permanently alters the natural seabed relief. This means the seabed continues to fundamentally adjust to its new bathymetry long after the physical island is finished. Large grains built the highly visible luxury real estate. Fine grains helped define its far less visible, widely distributed environmental footprint. But sediment does not act alone in this extensively altered marine ecosystem. Its long-term effects depend entirely on how quickly the surrounding water can actually replace and dilute what enters it. Residence time does not automatically create pollution out of nowhere. It is the master clock that dictates exactly how long pollution, heat, or nutrients may remain available to cause negative effects. To clearly understand this mechanism, we can follow three hypothetical inputs entering different parts of the enclosed lagoon. These are strictly illustrative transport paths, not specifically reported contamination events. Imagine fine suspended sediment, nutrient-rich wastewater leakage, and heat accumulating in shallow water, all entering the system at once. If these inputs enter the fast exchange zone on the eastern side of the island, they are dispersed and exported relatively quickly. The 1.2-day residence time effectively flushes them out into the open sea, lowering their overall persistence under an equivalent input. But if those exact same inputs enter a slow exchange zone, recirculating deeply between the western fronds, the final outcome changes completely. Here, the water takes approximately 42 days to be substantially replaced by fresh ocean currents. The critical dilution process slows to a crawl, allowing the inputs to actively interact with the sediment and the biology for weeks. Longer residence time directly translates to much higher ecological sensitivity. Under suitable light conditions, slower dilution can allow algal growth to rapidly accelerate as those trapped nutrients continue to accumulate. If the biological demand becomes too high, localized oxygen depletion becomes a much more likely scenario within these highly sheltered pockets. Visibility drops, and ambient heat is allowed to stubbornly persist inside the slowly moving water mass. Higher risk does not mean permanent ecological collapse, but it fundamentally alters the baseline survival conditions. The island did not invent every single contaminant currently present in the Persian Gulf, but did it profoundly change how long the water must continuously live with one? The answer is written in the unequal flushing rates measured between the residential fronds. By redesigning the hydrodynamic flow, the physical shape of the development dictates which organisms can actually survive the resulting water quality stress. The water clock ultimately shapes which organisms can thrive in the new system. It selects for resilience over diversity. It is critical to evaluate these immense environmental changes without forcing a simple, completely one-sided biological verdict. We have to honestly look at both sides of the complete ecological ledger. There is undeniable ecological gain on the positive side of this balance sheet. The enormous volume of artificial rock provides a new, highly complex surface that acts as a vital refuge and feeding habitat. Fish can become incredibly abundant around these massive structures, and older artificial materials may eventually develop substantial coral cover. In a heavily modified and highly industrialized urban coastline, these extensive breakwaters undoubtedly contribute real mitigation value. But the other side of the ledger reveals the permanent ecological loss and the harsh reality of incomplete equivalence. The highly visible landmass permanently buried an enormous section of the original functioning seabed. The breakwater and the fronds altered sediment transport, changed the circulation, and permanently fragmented the surrounding marine environment. While artificial structures are highly productive, they essentially replace soft-bottom habitat with hard substrate, fundamentally changing the community structure. They heavily favor opportunistic species that are specifically adapted to quickly colonize urban coastlines. A few dominant species may thrive on the rocks, while the stable, highly specialized communities of a natural reef are completely displaced. Colonization takes years, and the incredibly complex ecological functions of the old system are simply not reproduced by the new one. More fish swimming around a breakwater does not automatically mean the original, natural ecosystem was fully restored. A developer can easily photograph massive schools of marine life congregating around a newly built protective rock wall. It is much harder to photograph the complex ecological functions that no longer exist on the buried seabed below. The island clearly created a novel ecosystem, but it remains a highly uncertain equivalence to what was lost. The substitution of habitat is a profound compromise, trading original biodiversity for engineered abundance. And this new, biologically colonized environment carries another massive, lifelong burden. Even if the marine ecology eventually reaches a new equilibrium, the physical island must still be actively defended against the sea. It is very easy to look at the massive rock crescent and simply assume this new coastline is permanently secure. But a 2023 peer-reviewed engineering study proved that permanence is actually a continuous coastal defense service. The study meticulously evaluated various upgrade alternatives for the Palm Jumeirah outer revetment. The primary objective was to explore exactly how to extend its design life for another 50 years while actively considering the pressures of sea level rise. Engineers analyzed wave run-up overtopping risks and the hydraulic stability of the rock armor under future water level scenarios. They looked at potential adaptation options like adding additional armor, modifying the berm geometry, or substantially increasing the overall protective capacity of the structure. This kind of forward-looking, detailed evaluation is highly responsible coastal engineering. It does not prove that the present revetment is defective, failing, or that the island is currently sinking into the Gulf. But this responsible engineering confirms a much deeper reality about artificial land megaprojects. Artificial land at sea remains land only because its physical protection continuously succeeds in meeting changing environmental conditions. A coastal revetment is specifically designed to dissipate incoming wave energy, resist armor movement, control overtopping, and ultimately protect the reclaimed fill behind it. If wave conditions become more energetic, or global sea levels rise, The original design parameters are naturally pushed closer to their structural limits. To maintain an acceptable level of risk, the protective capacity of that immense barrier must eventually be evaluated and upgraded. Climate change does not need to swallow the island overnight to be a massive financial and structural threat. It only needs to systematically keep raising the standard required to effectively defend it. The engineering clock never truly stops ticking once the artificial land is placed. Sea level rise can simply increase wave reach, accelerate adaptation frequency, and steadily drive up the long-term design cost of keeping the water out. The island therefore carries three distinct, simultaneous debts. It carries the historic construction debt, the daily circulation debt, and the heavy future permanence debt. These are the three massive environmental clocks that Dubai cannot switch off. Clock 1 is the construction debt. An enormous volume of seabed was extracted, marine material was relocated, natural habitats were permanently covered, and fine sediment was heavily redistributed. Clock 2 is the hydrodynamic debt. The engineered shape permanently altered how water exchange occurs along the coast. It created deeply unequal residence times that leave some specific zones highly sensitive to accumulated inputs, while sediment remains actively mobile. Clock 3 is the lifelong lifecycle debt. The massive revetment must perform flawlessly, monitoring must rigorously continue, climate assumptions must be constantly updated, and future adaptation options must definitely remain available. When you look at Palm Jumeirah strictly through the lens of these three clocks, you see two very different value systems operating at the exact same time. The highly visible value of the spectacular megaproject is undeniable. It generated an unprecedented length of private beaches, luxury residences, exclusive hotels, iconic global tourism imagery, and immense real estate value. But successfully maintaining that visible wealth continuously requires paying an entirely invisible cost. That cost is measured in severe ecological alteration, water quality risk, sediment management, habitat substitution, coastal defense renewal, and perpetual climate adaptation. The strongest question is not whether the megaproject successfully created real economic value. It clearly created highly valuable land and unprecedented global visibility for the entire city. The stronger question is exactly what the sea, the local ecosystem, and future engineers must continue doing to permanently preserve that value. This is the deeply hidden reality I find most unsettling. It challenges the very definition of permanent real estate. When you look at the island from the air, it looks completely finished and perfectly motionless. But almost everything that truly keeps it viable is actively moving right now. The water, the suspended sediment, the waves, the colonizing organisms, the rock armor, and the very design assumptions used to protect it are all in constant motion. The perfect aerial image brilliantly hides three unfinished, deeply active processes. The land was produced by entirely relocating a living seabed. The island permanently altered exactly how water and sediment move along the coast, and its permanence depends entirely on continuing ecological management and highly complex coastal engineering. Palm Jumeirah is not evidence that human engineering failed. It is incredible evidence that engineering thoroughly succeeded in creating a coastline whose environmental consequences did not simply end when the construction equipment was packed away. The real challenge was not merely building the land, but sustaining it against an ocean that never rests. From space, Palm Jumeirah will always look like a perfectly finished object. Below the surface, the water is still actively adjusting to its shape. Sediment is still endlessly responding to its massive rock barriers. Organisms are still painstakingly rebuilding communities on artificial rock, and coastal engineers are still calculating exactly what future protection may eventually require. Dubai completed the highly visible island. It did not complete the deep environmental consequences. The palm may have completely stopped growing on the map. Underwater, it is still being built. This documentary is explicitly for educational and analytical purposes, relying on available project records, peer-reviewed marine research, and engineering studies to deeply explore coastal megaprojects. It does not replace professional environmental or structural engineering assessments. If you want to truly understand the invisible systems and engineering realities running our modern cities, subscribe to the channel. Let me know down in the comments if you think the engineering achievement of Palm Jumeirah is truly worth its permanent environmental debt.